Hey there, and welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. I am thrilled to have with me a return guest on this podcast. Dr. and Professor Olle Johansson has agreed to join me again to discuss a really much needed to discuss topic that we have discussed somewhat in our last podcast of 5G and just EMF radiation and the dangers of it in general. But I wanted to go back to our previous podcast where we had mentioned that we would talk about 6G and 7G, this coming technology that we think we're so concerned already about 5G, but Dr. Johansson is going to fill us in a little bit more about what is this 6G and 7G that we should be aware of. But just to briefly catch you up on Dr. Johansson, he is a neuroscientist at the world-renowned Karolinska Institute and the leading authority in the field of EMF radiation and its health effects. And he has published actually more than 650 original articles, reviews, and book chapters, and conference reports in the field of neuroscience, dermatoscience, and the health effects of electromagnetic fields. So, and recently another article that he had just written has really I've taken note of it, and I really want to share it here today. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Johansson. How are you?
Well, I'm just fine. Thank you very much indeed. It's a great honor to be on the podcast again, and I hope we will have an exciting hour in front of us. So you just fire away your questions and we get started.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I really appreciate the work that you do, and I'm always trying to find out what you're doing. I mean, I know, as my understanding, you are retired from the Institute, correct?
Yes, I am, yes.
But you're still putting out this wonderful work and just this passion behind what you're doing to try to inform the general public about the common sense of what we need to be aware of with the health effects of EMF. So I just really commend you for that. And
thank you.
Yeah, and you recently, what was it in just this past couple of months? You wrote an article that let me see if I can actually showcase the title here. But it's called "To Understand Adverse Health Effects of Artificial Electromagnetic Fields, Is Rocket Science Needed or Just Common Sense?" I love that title. So can you tell me when was this written? Is this pretty recent, right?
Well, it goes back actually to a conference here in Sweden I was invited to. And at it was an editor, a book editor, Ingrid Fredriksson is her name. And she approached me after my lecture and said it was one of the best lectures she had ever heard. And she wanted me to write a chapter in her next book. And I said, no, I don't have the time, I don't have the capacity to do it. And at that time I was about to be retired. So I thought, no, I should not take on more work than I already have. But she was very persistent, and she came back. And every time I said, no way, no. But eventually, I just had to say, well, okay then, I will try to write a few pages. And I sat down and, I kind of collected ideas and experiences and impressions from the last 40 years of my work. Mm-hmm. And it very quickly emanated into that very much of the research had taken very long extra turns instead of heading directly to the core questions, the core issues. Mm-hmm. And I also found that very many of these questions very simply could be answered really without any scientific work. It was just a matter of common sense. Mm-hmm. And when I also had been out lecturing all over the world, including, of course, United States, as well as in Sweden, Europe, Asia, South America, and so on, I always had the impression that the audience, and the audience could be made up of, for instance, parents, they actually understood a lot more than scientists generally do. Mm-hmm. And, there's a very, very famous European Union report, which is called late lessons from early warnings, and in it, 14 environmental big questions or catastrophes was investigated after they had happened. And then it turned out that the last people to appear on the scene years and years after, for instance, the general public had realized that air pollution, for instance, was very dangerous. The last to appear were actually the scientists. So therefore, the European Union, they wrote this report, Late Lessons from Early Warnings, pointing to that very often the early warnings are clear, and you don't need any real scientific work to understand the impact of a water pollutant or an air pollutant, or in this case, of an electromagnetic field pollutant, which is everywhere, 24/7, wherever you live, work, or stay. Therefore, I sort of started to think from that point. And then I realized that sometimes maybe it's enough with common sense, and the science could be used, if at all, later on to fill in details and gaps in the reflections. And then I wrote this paper. And also, it was a very interesting thing that happened. If I go back to this conference I mentioned, it took place outside of Stockholm at a small town called Sigtuna. And after my lecture, there was a man who stood up, and he was very disappointed. And he spoke out and said that he had come to this conference with the notion that he should only discuss science, not politics. But then, then you don't understand anything. Whatever you do in your life, whatever you buy, whatever you think and so on, it is always co-flavored with politics, of course.
Yeah.
So I felt, that, wow, if you think that certain aspects of society is free of politics, then of course, you can go back and think about, for instance, when sports became politicized, if you call it like that. People realized that there was always a hand that rocked the cradle, even in sports or commerce or so on, and even in politics, there is politics, of course. And if you don't understand that, then I think you should go back to grammar school, actually,
Right. Well, and I agree. I mean, she wanted you to write for her book, but this what you wrote is almost a book in and of itself, but a really well written. And once you start reading it, it's like you can't stop. So that's why I'm going to include it in the show notes below, at least what I had found online for how to access it. But you were quoted in the excerpt as saying, as we are all rapidly being forced into the new generation of electronic gadgets and wireless services, sometimes referred to as the Internet of Things, and primarily based on the fifth generation or 5G of wireless communication, to be followed soon by 6G and 7G, more and more people are asking themselves if the ever-increasing levels of artificial electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, especially of the pulse type, really are safe for living organisms. So, Dr. Johansson, in your opinion, is it safe for us? And if not, I want to discuss what we need to consider knowing and doing about it.
Well, to begin with, it is not safe at all, and we do not need to only talk about human beings. There are so many studies on bacteria, on plants, on other types of animals, and some of these studies really keep me awake. For instance, I could mention, if we start at the bacteria level, in 2017, Tahiri and co-workers published a study which was extremely important. Namely, they irradiated bacteria of different types with the radiation from cell phones or from Wi-Fi routers. And to make a long story short, nothing really happened with the bacteria apart from one small detail. They became antibiotic resistant. And the very same year, 2017, the G20 countries had a special meeting here in Europe only about the fact that more than 25,000 Europeans are put to a premature death because of antibiotic resistance. And at this meeting by the G20 countries, it was also said that in 2050, more than 10 million people will die prematurely around the world because of the same. And in these two calculations, the Tahiri and co-worker results are not included. So the 10 million could easily be 7.3 billion people and a lot of livestock as well. And of course, for me, seeing the perspectives ahead, that's really scary. And also, of course, the studies that have been replicated so many, many times, namely regarding genotoxicity, which means that the radiation from cell phones, Wi-Fi routers, and so on, they break and destroy the DNA molecule, which makes up the genes of each cell. And when it comes to other products like food items, pharmaceutical drugs, and so on, it has been agreed upon that if you see such genotoxic effects during development of a new food item or a pharmaceutical drug, then you are not allowed to pursue the development, because it's a nightmare to let loose in the general population genotoxic effects. Because if you destroy the DNA and the genes, then you can introduce changes at the cellular level, making, for instance, the population infertile in the long run. But the funny thing is, and now again we come to the need of common sense. For gadgets such as cell phones, tablets, baby alarms, and Wi-Fi systems, this regulation is not in place. If it was, then of course the development should have been stopped a long time ago, because these studies go back already to the 1990s. But it just continues all the time. And in parallel, as you probably already know, other scientists have shown, and now we have sort of put pieces of the jigsaw puzzle into the picture, namely dramatic effects on male sperm cells. Sperm cells do not like cell phone radiation, for instance. They change their appearance, they are less viable, they move more badly, etc., etc. And other scientists, they have shown that you have an increasing effect on fertility. And for instance, Magras and Xenos from Greece, they showed that in the fifth generation of mice that have been irradiated, they had become completely infertile. That could mean, that if you call your grandchildren somewhere in the future, like 150 or 200 years from now, they cannot any longer get babies because of something you did before 2019. And for me, it's very odd that mom and dad, and that would be the parliament and the government of each country, that they don't, should we say, put a moratorium or stop this. But at the same time, which you may also have seen, there has recently been such developments in Italy, where they have concluded now that one has to investigate the effect of artificial electromagnetic fields on a broad scale, on a broad range, to find out what kind of health effects that could be inherited into these new technologies. But, while we are talking about this, the Internet of Things, where your toaster should call you, or your refrigerator should call you, or your vacuum cleaner should give a signal, or whatever, that is being developed at the same time. I heard some days ago that if you buy like a refrigerator, a freezer in Sweden nowadays, it's already actively in process of looking for communication. They already have radio transmitters in these refrigerators and freezers, and they are not connected yet, but they will soon be. So it's the classical thing, the left hand doesn't really know what the right hand is doing. And then I say again, in between, you need to have a brain and some common sense.
Yes. Yeah. You said in one of your quotes, I think it was like the Institute of Common Sense for Common Sense or something like that, because we have common sense has died and no one attended his funeral because no one knew that he died. So that's the
No, exactly.
unfortunate thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And another thing is, like, you had quoted in there, going along with the Internet of Things that you were talking about, is I decided that this is an issue that needs to be looked at much more closely and perhaps even needs, for serious reasons, to be stopped before it turns on us and other animals, plants, and bacteria as the idiocy of things over the years. So
Yeah.
I love that you could coin the term the idiocy of things. Can you tell my listeners exactly what is the Internet of Things? Because I think some people don't understand how everything is becoming connected, and having this little Alexa or Google in every one of our rooms just so it makes it easier to order something online is actually harming our health.
Well, indeed, the radiation, the electromagnetic fields and signals from these different antennae, they do have impacts on health parameters and so on. And just to come back to your sort of basic question, for me, it's very odd that all of your household gadgets should interplay electronically with each other and with your terminal, your cell phone, or your tablet, or whatever you have, because I'm always asking myself, what is the actual need? Why should I have a call from a refrigerator telling me as a grown-up man that I need to buy milk? I have been able to do that for decades and decades, and I just cannot see the need for all of this. And I think, again, the need here talks rather about greed. Some people, some companies want to sell things and gadgets and make a profit out of it. And it's up to the consumers to say, no, thank you. And I mean, personally, I'm very need-based. I don't buy any extra things that I don't need in any way. And I think it's more and more obvious also to mankind. And now we sort of jump into a much broader perspective with environmental issues, the plastic mountain, global warming and so on. We just cannot keep on consuming as we have done the last 50 or 100 years. We have to hold back. And then again, the Internet of Things, the question is, what is the need? And one thing that has been discussed a lot is, of course, that you will also have the possibility of a totalitarian control. You will know where people are, what they are doing. And I just saw some days ago that for instance, in the People's Republic of China, they have this facial recognition system. So if you try to run away, it's just impossible, you know. You will be picked up by cameras and sent to the central computer. And the question is that what we want to have? Or do we want to have integrity that we are used to? And this is, of course, discussions that needs to be held at the political level as well. But you cannot allow the politicians to decide here. It must be the citizens that are in charge of the decisions. And unfortunately, I would say in Sweden at least, many citizens are too much occupied in liking each other on Facebook, in sending photographs on Instagram, in other things, using their smartphone. So they don't pay any attention. They don't have time, you know, to pay attention to the really important questions of society. And therefore, I also felt that this chapter was important, even if only a few people read it. It will still sort of be a legacy that is left behind. At least someone stood up and said, hey, stop. Shouldn't we think this over once again? Do we really need this? Do we really want this? And I see more and more that people are hesitant. More questions are being put. And just by being part of your podcast, an example of that, very intelligent discussions are being held all over the planet, but more needs to come, of course.
Right. Yeah, and like there was an issue where I heard that there's diapers now that you can have little devices in that tell you when your baby is wet, and it sends a little note to your smartphone to let you know the baby's wet. At what point did we lose the ability to check the baby? Like we've lost the ability, it seems like, to entertain the baby because we stick an iPad in front of the baby, and now we can't even check our own baby's diaper. So not only is it harming our health, but it's harming our relationships because we've become this nation of like, let's not touch, let's not talk, let's just do everything electronically. And I really feel like I agree with everything you said about like it's surreal, the state of the earth that we're in, but yet there are things that we can do. And that's really what I wanted to talk with you about is like, what are some things that we have at our disposal to do? And
yes, I was going to come to that. And it was very good you brought up the kind of baby alarm systems, including diapers with sensors in them and so on. And, you know, just an ordinary baby alarm, people don't understand that when they toss it down into the crib or hang it on the side, the exposures, and we have just measured it some days ago, it is in the order of 10 up to the power of 11 or 12 times above the natural background. These gadgets are extremely strong radiators and transmitters. And these fields suddenly are there, you know, they are invisible, but they are there, impacting the baby in the crib. And it's interesting because you ask, what can we do? And one of the companies, I cannot tell you which, that are producing these kind of baby alarms, they have approached us and asked, can we in some way shield these colossal levels of electromagnetic signals to bring it down as much as possible in order not to harm the small baby living there. And then again, you know, for me I'm an old man, as you know, for me, it's again a question of common sense. I don't know for parents in other parts of the world, but Swedish moms and dads, they don't want to leave their baby alone.
right.
That's the most precious gift they've ever received.
Preach
And
it.
they love it. They want to spend time with it all the time, you know, and they have the baby close by. And therefore, the commercial side of it in Sweden says that here it's not a big seller. Not very many people buy baby alarms because they just don't need it.
Yeah, I didn't use one because for the first 6 months, the baby just slept on me in a little carrier. I didn't want to be away from her, so she just slept.
Exactly. No, I mean, that's my impression of mothers and fathers. They just don't want to leave the small baby. It's such a fascinating miracle they have received, and they want to be every second with the baby, and they carry it around and so on, you know. And for me, it's surprising to even imagine that you should leave your baby for, well, an hour or two with an electronic surveillance gadget. Maybe you should have got yourself some other gift than a baby then, you know.
Well, and to entertain it with some sort of gadget. Like it's our job as parents to educate our children, not let it be in the hands of some sort of technology that we're not really even sure of what it's doing to the child, because they're so small, they're so concentrated, it's affecting them way more than it's affecting us. So to that effect, like this Internet of Things is one thing, but tell me what we need to know about 6G and 7G and the dangers of it, because no one's even talking about this. So this may be one of the very first podcasts that people actually hear about 6G and 7G.
Well, at the telecommunications industry, they are of course already developing the fifth generation wireless telecommunication, as they had done with 2G, 3G, 4G, and 4G. And if you look closely on the previous Gs, you can actually put, should we call it 3.5G and 2.5G and so on. Every G was developed, and that goes for the fifth generation as well. And when I meet people from different telecommunication companies, they already talk a lot about 6G and 7G being on the kind of drawing board, but very advanced. And for each generation, more and more information will be added. It will be more and more speed into the system, and the consumer should have more information. And the question is still, which I as a neuroscientist ask, what kind of information do they need, these people, these modern people? And as you know, when you look around, I always travel with commuter train and subway and buses and so on. I mean, most people, they don't use these cell phones and so on for any revolutionary information. It's as I said before, it's checking your Facebook profile, sending pictures, etc. So the need is still with a big question mark. And therefore, it's again interesting to read about, as I said before, the Italian court order about public safety and a public safety campaign, which must begin by July 16 this year. That is in a way, should we say, a victory for advocates of precaution, because at least in Italy, they take these measures, precautionary measures, and of course they are afraid that in the long term run something bad will happen. And as you probably know, Italy had already had 2 court cases regarding brain tumors, where the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the patient, saying that yes, the brain tumor was caused by the cell phone. So they are quite advanced there. And I know that in the United States, there are lawyers that are preparing for trials at court regarding brain tumors and so on. So in the next few years, I think a lot will happen from a precautionary point of view. And coming back to what you said also, I very often get that question, that what can I do as a consumer or citizen? And I think, to begin with, everyone that will listen to your podcast, they have made a good choice. They get information, and they should, of course, not blindly trust us. They should do their own reading, their own contemplation, their own thinking, and their own decisions for themselves and their loved ones. At least here in Europe, it's not very uncommon that people scale down and take away quite a lot of things in their home. You mentioned, for instance, children that are always parked together with a cell phone or a tablet. That you can change. You can always, as a parent, ask yourself, do I have to put my kids in front of this, or do I have other options? Can we do something together? Could we go outdoors? In Sweden, and I know it's the same in the United States, that you have a fantastic nature you can walk around in and look at and do things, and you can try to separate children from these electronic gadgets. And the same, of course, with grown-ups. For the latter, I'm not so hopeful, because at least in Stockholm, if you walk around here, it's like a scene from a Hollywood robot movie. People are zombie-sized, and they just watch their smartphone, and there have even been accidents, serious accidents, when people have walked right out into the traffic and so on. So people are addicted, or maybe even more. They are kind of engulfed by these smartphones. And already 2015, the OECD, this giant organization, came to the conclusion that the usage of smartphones, tablets, and so on in schools uh, um, actually dumbed the kids down. They did less well in school. So it's not so impressive as a tool, really. And again, when I talk about this, I have a picture of a garden rake. And I say to people that if you give people a rake and allow them only to use this year after year, they do not become gardeners. There is so much more to all of this.
Yeah.
So I think many Asian countries, as you probably have read about, they are now trying to diminish the usage time for children and teenagers in front of computers, laptops, tablets, and so on. And of course, if you want to be a little bit dramatic, I guess a country like China, they want to be in supremacy. They want to take over the whole show. And a way to do that is to have brilliant citizens that are not dumbed down by these electronic gadgets.
No, and actually, they call it smart technology, but some of the smartest people I know were the individuals that grew up in the time of the generations that did not have any sort of technology. So like my grandmother was one of the most wise, smart women I've ever known. And my mother, who didn't grow up with any technology other than TV, was one of the most wise women I knew. And yet, and I myself was on the cusp of like the technology, back in like the 80s and 90s when the Game Boy came out. I mean, that's the only exposure we had. And all these people grew up just fine. Like we all learned things and we all got smart. And yet now we feel like if we don't hand the tablet to our child, or if we don't have a tablet in every child's hand in a school system, that they're somehow going to miss out. Well, instead, they're not missing out.
You're very right in this. And I mentioned the small town of Sigtuna outside of Stockholm. In Sigtuna, they also have a boarding school for children to the very, very rich people. And I gave a lecture there many years ago. And then I found out that kids who had parents in the computer, electronics, and telecommunication industry, they were not allowed to use these gadgets.
Right, yes.
So the very smart ones, they realize that it's smarter to be very broad in your education and also not to aim for smartness, but I would say aim for adultness.
Yeah, and
that's lacking very often,
So going back to like what you said about one of the best things they can do is gain awareness and do their own research as to how they can avoid these things and how they not give them to our children. I actually have been doing some research because ever since you enlightened me that there was the coming 6G and 7G, I've been trying to find any sort of information I could on it, which has been very little. But what I did found looks like that technology is going to require some sort of implantation inside our body to be able to use it. Have you found that to be true? Which is really scary to me, by the way.
And I have read the same. And to begin with, when I did the same exercise as you did, I looked for information. I then found out that actually on the internet, there are articles already about 10G. So, this
That'll be our next
this is very rapidly moving ahead. And among the different articles, there were also discussions. And as you probably know, there are Swedish companies that have offered their employees to have implants on these RFID chips. And that is, of course, a step. You can become a hot citizen, you have a chip. So you don't need to show your credit card and so on. But of course, that's the very first step to really control. And if you remember my article in the book on the very first page, I also pointed to that this type of gadgets, including the Internet of Things, implants and so on, very easily can be used for political, military and commercial surveillance purposes. And you can develop it into some kind of Internet of totalitarian control. And that, of course, may sound as science fiction, but if I would have said to my grandmother that in the future people would be able to walk the streets and look on television in their telephones, she would probably have brought out the Bible and read something for me. You know. For her, that would have been impossible. And that's just like 30, 40 years ago, you know. So developmental pace is too rapid. And I think people, again, need to really take control of the control, if you say like this, because there are a lot of commercial ideas, military ideas, political ideas, and maybe you don't find them in Sweden, maybe you don't find them in United States, but maybe you find them in some other country or in some other company. And anything that is possible to do, people will do, especially if there is a profit involved.
Yeah, and another piece that you touch on in your article is the NTP project, and that's one area that people could start researching on their own to really find out what testing is showing the harmful effects. And so, can you explain the NTP project to my listeners and the results of those studies?
Well, yeah, very shortly. It's a fantastic study to begin with. It ran for a long period of years. It consumed a lot of American dollars. It's very detailed, it's very accurate, it's fantastic. And they arrive at the conclusion that exposure to mobile telephony, the radiation, the microwaves, could mean a risk for brain tumors and heart tumors. The latter ones are called schwannomas. And after it was published, also the Italian Ramazzini group have come forward with similar ideas. And of course, all of this goes back to the very elegant investigations of the Swedish doctor Lennart Hardell, who very early pointed to that there was an association with long-term exposure and long-term use of mobile telephony and the presence of brain tumors. And hopefully, of course, all of this will sort of be wrong, or what you should say, you know. But for every year, more and more pieces are added. And this is probably also the reason why all the big players have left. They have abandoned the ship. And, you know, among them you have, of course, the manufacturers of telecommunication gadgets. You have the operators. You have the radiation protection authorities. You have the World Health Organization. And above all the world's insurance and reinsurance companies. They have said, no way, we don't touch this in any way at all. And that is much more telling, I would say, than any Swedish scientist on a podcast. You know, I could talk about test tubes and rats and mice and DNA and so on, but for the consumer, realizing that we are alone on this ship and we are traveling forward, and the only ones that are left are the government and parliament. And that's also interesting because I hear from lawyers like in the United States, they are not any longer after, for instance, the manufacturers like Motorola and Nokia and Ericsson. No, they're instead aiming at your Senate, Congress, and that kind of levels of society. And that's also, how should I say, ironic, because then people in the future, they will sue their government and their parliament, and then they're actually suing themselves because these entities are based upon taxpayers' money. So it's really ironic, you know. And of course, the other big players, they have left the ship, swam away, and you cannot even see them any longer. And don't believe this has been done in secrecy, because it hasn't. Not at all. They have been completely open and public about it. I remember, for instance, 16, 17 years ago, in Swedish daily newspapers, there were big articles about the fact that, for instance, Lloyd's UK and the world's largest reinsurance company, which is called Reassurance in Switzerland, and all other companies, they have completely left any form of responsibility or liability regarding health effects of electromagnetic fields.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And when you tell people this, they don't believe you. They look shocked. When you then show them the paperwork, then they realize that, what? No one has told us this. And in the same way, when I tell parents that they actually put their kids into an exposure situation that is cancer classified by the World Health Organization as the same category as DDT, formalin, diesel and petrol fumes, welding smoke, and so on, again, they look shocked, they don't believe you. But when you show them the actual official paperwork, again, they realize that, what? No one has told us this,
Mm-hmm.
And they get, and sorry for my English, but they get pissed. They get really upset, not at me, but at the health authorities, the radiation protection authorities, government, and the parliament.
Yeah, well, and it goes alongside the whole, like you were mentioning, they look like zombies walking around with these rectangles in their hand. And part of that is that the other aspect of cell phones and smart devices is the blue light technology that actually depletes dopamine, and dopamine causes you to not question anything. So these zombies start accepting everything they're told. So when someone like what you and I are doing finally expose some things, they go, wow, that never even crossed my mind. I never realized that. So it's not something anybody's talking about, but it's not also anything that anybody's asking. We've just accepted the fact that modernized technology is just what we do and what we have. And everybody has a little rectangle that they walk around with now. And yet, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And so I wanted to go back to kind of to explain a little bit further the Internet of Things that's going to go along with everything. I know people understand that, like, maybe the smart devices, like their appliances, and of course their cell phones, their tablets, their computers, but there's a lot out there that I don't think people are realizing that are also the Internet of Things, such as, like you were mentioning, baby monitors and baby alarms, but also just these little Fitbits and these little Bluetooth devices that are on people's body monitoring and tracking their movement. I mean, this too is the Internet of Things. And it's anything like the little Roombas that go around your house and vacuum your floor and connect to Wi-Fi to hear a signal from you when they're supposed to turn on, all of this. And even something as simple as a cordless DECT phone. Maybe you're not even using smart technology, but there are things that are also emitting these electromagnetic fields. And I wanted you to just briefly share with some of those things that maybe people aren't realizing that they're connected to.
That's a very important point. And I remember some 2-3 years ago, I saw an interview with Edward Snowden, who exposed a lot of military secrets. And he was interviewed in a hotel somewhere in, I think it was Hong Kong, by a British journalist and so on. And during the interview, the journalist brought up his cell phone, and he said, well, in the future, Mr. Snowden, I'm sure we will also use cell phones to spy on people. And then Edward Snowden just calmly said, that we have done for many years. So, even if you have, like I'm sitting in front of a laptop computer now, when we are finished here, I will put it to sleep. Right. But it will still monitor anything. If anyone wants to monitor me, it could. Mm-hmm. And people don't realize that there are so many things in their home that could keep track, and we should just hope that no one is interested in what you are doing. It's not very fascinating, I could tell you. But it's just the kind of risk. And you forgot to mention, for instance, the smart cars buses, trains,
Mm-hmm.
aircrafts, and so on, all being interconnected in the same way. Smart roads, smart paywalks, smart rooms, smart illumination, smart heating, smart utility, electricity, blah, blah, blah. You know, you can take anything you have back home. I even saw an ad a few days ago, since I'm very keen on amateur gardening. There are now flower pots that are smart. So they will call your cell phone and tell you that you need to water the plant.
Oh my gosh.
I used to look at it, and if you're blind, you touch it and you touch the soil.
Right.
You don't need these kind of things. But of course, it's dreamland for anyone wanting to sell things. At the same time, I suppose they will break down, because all technical gadgets do. So the maintenance folk, they will love this. And in Sweden, you know, there is a big discussion about artificial intelligence, which is a prolongation of this discussion, actually. And people will have more and more robots. You mentioned a dust cleaner, for instance. You can have a lawnmower and so on. That is a robot, but even more advanced robots like that. And what is not very much discussed yet is the fact that a lot of people will lose their job. And I just listened some days ago on a discussion about this. And I mean, in a country like Sweden, maybe 2 out of 3 people will lose their job in the coming 10 years. And the question is, of course, what should they do then?
Right.
You know, unoccupied animals of any sort, they quickly get stressed, nervous, and violent.
Yes.
That's what we want to have?
No, and going back to the devices too, somebody gave us a gift recently because we grill a lot, and they gave us this wireless thing that you put in the meat, and it sends a signal to your phone to tell you when your meat has hit temperature. And when I was given it, I told my husband, I'm like, you can give that away as a regifter, because I can go and test my meat on the grill with my bare hands, or with cutting it open. Like I just don't want that kind of technology. So I'm kind of the odd man out, but that's why I want to bring it to people's attention, because however interesting and cool it seems, these are actually things that are harming our health. Because if it can go through the walls of your house outside on your patio to the grill, it can go through you, and it can cause DNA cellular damage.
Yeah. And not only could, it does go through you. It does result in changes at the molecular and cellular level. And many of these changes, when you read actual scientific papers, they are more than scary. And I promise you, you will not sleep well that night at all, because many of the results, they are really, really very scary. As I talked about the antibiotic resistance before, you know. So there are so much out there. And I often get the question, how many papers are we actually talking about? How many scientific publications? And just the German website called EMF Portal, they have more than 26,000 publications, and probably there are a lot more than that, and they're all pointing in the same direction, namely the direction which the insurance companies, the manufacturers, and so on have taken, namely to run, leaving the consumers behind, you know.
Yes, and it's even before the Internet of Things. I mean, there was study after study on power lines way back in the day, and they can read that book, Going Somewhere, by Andrew Marino, because he depicts how many studies there actually were done on just simple things like power lines and transformers outside of Wi-Fi.
Excellent work.
Excellent.
Excellent work by Professor Marino. You're fantastic work.
Yeah, I actually tried to have him come on the podcast, but he didn't want to. So I think he's pretty humble.
You must try again, because he's a fantastic person. You must try again.
I might, yeah. But I just really wanted to bring awareness that it's the wiring inside our home. It's the decked. It's even the cordless decked phones. It's the game.
Oh yeah, and you know they are not they are not smartphones, and that means that they will radiate at a constant and very high level, because they don't need to save any battery power.
Yeah, and yeah, I love that you are encouraging people to do their homework and gain awareness, see what they're surrounded with, number one, and then number two, to start eliminating some of those. You know, I even say to my clients, just one less thing, like just get rid of one thing, maybe the TV out of your bedroom, maybe turning and not bringing your cell phone into the bed at night, or maybe turning off your Wi-Fi at night when you don't need it. You know, one less exposure. But what else would you recommend as far as like people are listening to this? What more steps can they take to mitigate this?
I mean, I would actually go through my workplace as well as my home, taking up everything I have, and ask myself, do I and my children, family, do we need electric toothbrushes, for instance, or could we do it by hand? Could we whip the cream by hand, or do we need an electric cream whipper? And so on, you know. And also, you mentioned before cell phones. In Sweden, just very recently, there is a company called RP, which stands for Radiation Protection of Sweden, RP of Sweden. They have launched shells for your cell phone, which bring down the exposure dramatically, actually, without losing functionality or battery time. So if you Google RP of Sweden, you can order, and such a shell would cost in the order of $50. It's a very cheap way of at least doing something. And there are other companies like in Poland where you can have mats which you put under your laptop. You can Google for that, and simple things to at least take away. It's a little bit like introducing filters on cigarettes. Do as much as you can, you know. And hopefully it will turn out in the future that you darling, I was wrong. There are no problems, there are no risks, you know, and then you can toss away all these protective devices. But if we are right and you haven't done anything, then I understand why the insurance company have fled.
Well, I will say this as far as you were saying about the tumors in the heart. I've been seeing more and more people that I know having heart issues more so than ever. Not just heart disease, but tachycardia and all these heart arrhythmias and heart tumors, like you mentioned. And
further down in ages, you know, kids having heart attacks. I mean, what are we talking about? It's a negative development indeed, you know.
Yeah, I think people forget that the heart is electric, and so it's conductive.
Yeah,
all of these.
Well, the whole body is. Yeah, the whole body is, but particularly the heart and the brain, of course. But all cells are electric in that sense, even sperm cells, egg cells, and so on, you know.
Yeah, so I'm going to put some of these recommendations you mentioned in the show notes too, like the EMF portal and the RP of Sweden, so people can check that out as well. I think, what would you say to the fact that another way that people can mitigate and have one less is actually by limiting or even eliminating their social media? Like, I actually, this past winter, couldn't stand the idea of going back on Instagram, even just for my business postings, like just to post things for business marketing and stuff. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't know what I know about the time it takes to spend on the internet doing that, or on my smartphone doing that, and continue. So I left it. And and I'm not a big social media person. And so I feel like it helps in the fact that if you're not on there all the time, or you're not posting all the time, either you're limiting it or you're eliminating it. It could be another avenue that it gets you off of that mentality of, oh, this is what I do.
I agree. But I would also add a third thing. And you know, Swedes, we are very kind of boring, you know. I would also add, never start it. I have never, ever used Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and so on, you know. Why should I? As I said before, you know, I'm need-based. I just don't need these things, because if I should spend time on it, I wouldn't have time to talk with you. I wouldn't have time to spend, I don't even remember how many weeks I spent on this chapter for the book. And how many years I've spent on doing research, if I should at the same time interact with social media and send pictures of birthday cakes and whatever. No, I just cannot do it. And since I'm need-based, I always, as I said before, I always check out carefully what kind of asset is included into a certain gadget or a certain system or whatever. And most of the things that people buy and use, they actually don't need. So
I think that's a great place to kind of titrate down the podcast by asking, people asking me, what in my life do I actually need versus have or want or fit in with society, and what is benefiting myself and my family in the long run versus just a nice convenience, because when the chips are down and life comes to its end for all of us, are we going to remember about, oh, it was so neat to have that, like Wi-Fi enacted vacuum that went around my house. It made life so much easier. Or are we going to say, how much time do I spend face to face with my loved ones? How much time do I spend really invested in nature and enjoying the earth versus enjoying the latest post on Facebook?
Yeah, I love what you say now, because I so often here in Sweden see small children, girls and boys, and they are calling for mommy or daddy. But mommy and daddy, they don't hear them because they are looking at the smartphone, watching some Google or Facebook or whatever it is, and they're keeping on mommy, 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 and they don't get any contact. And then I also feel exactly as you do. I don't want to kind of end up at St. Peter at the pearly gates, and he's saying, why did you spend all this time in front of the computer and television set and smartphone, etc.? I think it would be much nicer if he said, well, you played your role in society, in the real life society. Social media, after all, they are electronic. And it's not forbidden, at least not in Sweden, to talk to people. I always talk to people in the underground and in the buses and trams and so on, and people love it because nowadays it's kind of so there you are,
Yes. So
and I should just say that if I'm ever allowed to come back, I think next time we should also talk about. I very often get questions, especially from the United States, namely about the functional impairment electrohypersensitivity.
Yes, I would definitely love to talk about that with you. And so, yes, we will have another podcast for sure. We'll be in touch about that because that's something I really think people need to be aware of. I even like your phrase on that about how hypersensitive is what actually should be normal, and hypo, where people are just not sensing the sensitivity, is what's considered normal, but it's really not. So,
if the rats in the NTP study had sensed the electromagnetic fields, they would have, of course, left the laboratories and they would not have become cancer patients.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to do another podcast on that. So, in the meantime, what would you recommend people, if they want to check you out, or if they have a question, can they email you, or is there a way to
they could definitely email me, but I should just warn them that it might take a few hours or days because there are very many people around the world that have questions, and please make the question as short as possible, and I will try to answer it to the best of my capacity.
Okay, great. So I'll put that, or you can give me an email, or you can give the listeners an email if you want to use, or I can put it in the
Yes, my email address is very easy to remember. It's Olle, that's OLLE .Johansson, which is JOHANSSON, and then 500, immediately following 500 at gmail.com.
Okay, and I'll include that in the show notes too. Dr. Johansson, I so appreciate it, and I could just talk to you all day, but we don't want to be on devices all day, so I'll let you go for now. But thank you once again for talking.
The same to you. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be joining your podcast, and your questions are really at the top level of what we need to discuss today.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, we'll do it again for sure then.
Okay, bye-bye then.
Okay, bye for now. So do you ever drop an F-bomb? I know I do, but I drop one in a healthy way, and I get them from dropnfbomb.com. And you can get yours and save 20% with my promo code GETFIT, GETFIT, all one word. And that's going to save you 20% off. And these are handy dandy little nut butter packets if you like nut butter, or oil packets to take on the go with you. They have MCT oil packets, they have avocado oil packets, which I love to healthfully fry things in and add to salads and stuff like that. So check them out, dropnfbomb.com. They've also got some really cool t-shirts there. I personally like the one that says fat on with an exclamation point. So that's pretty cool. So check them out, get your code, and go today to save and drop an F-bomb in a healthy way. Anne Marie Skincare is the most high-quality organic skincare line I have found as of yet, and I so enjoy using their products. Highly recommend them and think that you should check them out for sure. So visit their website, annemariesskincare.com, or click the link below and get yourself a sample restore kit to try for only $9.99. So just click that link below in the show notes and check them out today. When it comes to getting your vitamin D, the sun is always number one. But if you can't get out into the sunshine because your job doesn't allow you to be outside very much, or you just have that part of the world where you don't have the access you would like to have to amazing vitamin D from the fresh sun in the blue sky, I highly recommend checking out LiveWise Naturals. This is a vitamin D drop that I use that they carry that actually it does amazing things to up that vitamin D level when you can't get into the sun. It's combined with MK7, which is a very well done form of K2 that helps to absorb the D3. So make it in your skin when you can, but when you can't, check out LiveWise Naturals and enter code GETFIT to save 10% on their vitamin D3 drops. I use them and I highly recommend them.